started interviewing Israelis and Palestinians who already sit together in ayahuasca ceremony.
Welcome to Standing Up. Hello, hello, hello. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening. Whenever and wherever you're watching this, it's great to have you here. I just finished a great talk with Natalie Ginsberg. She works for MAPS, the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies. So essentially what Natalie does, she works in the space of psychedelics, using psychedelics as medicine. Many view psychedelics as foreign, they view it as some hard drug. There's a lot of data, and we speak about this, a lot of data to support its benefit as a medicine and its potentially transformative effects that it has on people. As you can see, I dressed for the occasion. That's it. Enjoy the episode. Welcome, Natalie. It's great to have you here. Just a little background for the audience. You and I, we met, I think, probably 9 years ago. And back then, you just graduated from Yale. You studied history. I don't think then you or I would ever guess that today you would be working at MAPS, the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies. So how did that happen? How did you go from a history student at Yale to working in the field of psychedelics?
It's a good question, and it's definitely true. I have to say some of my colleagues have been, passionate about this their whole life, but that was not my path. And as you said, I definitely would have never guessed this. Well, when I met you, I had just moved to Tel Aviv after graduating, and in that time applied to go to social work school. So at my time at Yale, I was always interested in criminal justice reform and racial justice. So I worked in prisons and I interned for the Brooklyn DA's office one summer. But that experience in particular really affected me because I found that a lot of the cases that were coming in for us to process were 13-year-old Black boys in Brooklyn arrested for like crumbs of cannabis, literally crumbs, such tiny amounts. And their lives would literally be ruined by this tiny, citation. They would lose ability to get scholarships to college, sometimes would even lose like their family's positioning in public housing. And as a Yale student, actually as a high school student before going to Yale, I had been smoking some cannabis in a park in New York City, and a cop came up to me and was like, "Honey, put that out. Aren't you going to college?" And that just struck me so much because even if the cop had done something to me, I was so privileged and lucky in a position I would have paid off the ticket and been totally fine. And so that just really sat with me. And that experience started to make me question what was going on with our drug policy and how our drug policy was really impacting our whole system of mass incarceration. The US incarcerates more people per capita than any other country in the world. And drug policy was really kind of a driving force in that. But so after I graduated Yale and was living in Israel, and then was actually feeling called to social work in this context. I wanted to be a therapist and a social worker with folks that were incarcerated. And at social work school, I had the honor and privilege of being a therapist in a middle school in the South Bronx in one of the poorest neighborhoods in the country. And then I also worked at an alternative sentencing court for people arrested for prostitution. So instead of jail time, they were offered therapy with me. And those experiences were also deeply impactful because I saw so clearly that so much of the trauma that the kids I worked with and the sex workers I worked with were facing was from these systems like racism, how police treated them, how their parents were incarcerated, and there were so many bigger level issues. And I saw that so much of our therapy was actually focused on symptoms. It was like, oh, you can't sleep, here's a pill to help you sleep, or you feel a little anxious, here's something to like calm your anxiety. And I don't mean to demean that, because it's super important to be able to calm yourself and to sleep. But I was really intrigued by addressing the root cause of these traumas instead of just focusing on the symptom level. And so that kind of opened me up a bit, or I guess, you know, there's a lot of factors at play, and I'm kind of losing a little of the order, but what actually happened was that work inspired me to get back into drug policy. So my last year of social work school, I was a policy fellow at the Drug Policy Alliance, that works to end the war on drugs globally and specifically in the US. And I was lucky, I worked on the team that actually legalized medical cannabis in New York, which was quite exciting. And we also decriminalized cannabis, which prevented police from arresting people of color disproportionately for cannabis in New York. So I was working on those campaigns and really learning more about the war on drugs in that context, but had my therapy experience of wanting a different mode of therapy. And then when I was at Drug Policy Alliance, I started reading about this crazy psychedelic therapy thing that I was reading in 2 or 3 sessions could would help people get rid of their addiction and PTSD and all of these illnesses that in social work school I was taught there's no cure. It's like, if you have addiction, you have it the rest of your life, and we can just work with people to manage it. And then I was reading about studies with LSD that in 3 sessions, people were not addicted anymore to alcohol. So that for me was a signal that was really about addressing the root cause, and rather like instead of focusing on the symptoms. And so that just really intrigued me. And I reached out to MAPS and was like, please, I really, this really calls to me, but they're a pretty small organization. And so I kind of had to bug them a little bit. And luckily, Rick, the founder and director, realized that he actually needed some support on the policy side of things, which was my background of it after Drug Policy Alliance, because MAPS is really focused on research, which I'll say a bit more about in a second. But so I got pretty lucky that at that time he needed support with policy, and that was 6 years ago. So I came and started the policy team at MAPS, and yeah, the rest is history. It's one of those things that as soon as you start to learn, it just keeps kind of pulling you in and in, because it's just so interesting and so effective, and so many people just have these powerful stories about how this completely changed their life and saved their life. And I feel really, really honored to be able to do that work. But it is really funny. I know that story was very windy, and most people I work with are like, psychedelics saved my life. And I'm like, well, the research and this and that and all these things led me there. But I'm super grateful for the way that I arrived here and that I'm here now.
It's cool that you were brought into psychedelics through data and not experience. That's what it seems like happened. I found my love for psychedelics through experience, like I think most people. I took LSD a few times in high school, but I didn't take it in the environment or with the people or in the state of mind to have a truly profound experience. Sure, it was fun. Sure, I laughed for hours. Sure, I felt things that I've never felt, but only in my, I guess, early 20s, when I was already living in Tel Aviv, I took mushrooms in nature with friends, and that's when I understood that psychedelics has transformative potential. It's something, and then I saw that the data supports this. It's something that you take once and it can change you forever, and most people will say that it has changed them forever positively. So again, I'm not basing this off the data. I'm going, maybe you have data to support this, but
the data would back that up too. There's an interesting study, like a survey of folks who've tried psychedelics, and like a vast majority include their psychedelic experiences in their top 5 most meaningful experiences of their life. like, after the birth of their child and like marriage, it's like right up there. So a lot of people definitely agree with what you're saying.
There we go. That's not surprising at all, because myself and everybody I've spoken to really says the same thing. It's something that can just change you overnight. And I'm assuming some people in the audience have never tried them. So maybe let's try to get into more details of how it changes you. So I could share my experience. It gave me this feel of connectedness to everything. Like you feel like you're in rhythm with the universe. And I know that sounds hard to understand what that means, but you really feel a connection to all things. I remember hugging a tree and feeling the energy of the tree. And
just laughing, because that's what the non-psychedelic people just expect us to do, but trees are pretty awesome. So
well, they are. And since that day, I now forever feel the energy of trees when I hug them. And I guess it's always been there. I've just never really truly paid attention. I think it helped make me a more peaceful person, a more calm person. What are some experiences either you or other people have had that is life-changing for them?
Like so many. Because I've been really privileged to watch many tapes from our research, which maybe I should speak a bit about our research to give a sense of that. But I'll say, like, as a whole, like what you're talking about, this rhythm and connection to nature, in our research, we and our therapists talk about connecting to your inner healing intelligence. And I feel like that inner intelligence is also an outer intelligence that a tree would have also. But there's something particularly powerful about tuning into your, like, inside yourself and feeling that connection inside of yourself to other people, to the planet, to trees, to animals, and kind of trusting that connection in a different way can be really healing. And I guess, to speak more about that, so MAPS was founded over 30 years ago with the purpose of developing MDMA into a prescription medicine approved by the government, and we're quite close to that in Israel and the US actually in the next year or two. We expect that to happen. But so we have this system of having 2 therapists and 1 patient, and they, after having a few normal therapy sessions, they have one with the medicine, with the MDMA. And they take MDMA with the therapist and have a comfy bed and blindfold and music. And they go inside and process their trauma. And I give that context because I want to share some of those stories that are quite meaningful to me when you ask, like, what are some of the ways it's changed people? One example that comes to mind is from a veteran who had been deployed in Iraq, and she was processing this one scene of being at war, and she was on a tank, and these children were like coming at her somehow, and she was saying, like, why were those fucking children need to get away from the tank, get away from the fucking tank, and like I had to shoot at them, and just think she was like shooting at the floor next to them or something to scare them away, but she was like, I had to fucking shoot at them, they shouldn't have been coming at us. And then she all of a sudden, like, different voice, different energy, was like, wow, why was I in a position where I had to shoot at these children? I was just trying to help my country and protect my country. But how is that protecting my country? Like, that's like, it kind of like made her examine, like, she until that point had been holding on to guilt, like that it was her fault that she was shooting those children, and she was trying to I had to, but really she felt really awful that she was shooting at children, and that was a deep moral injury, a deep trauma that sat within her. And the MDMA allowed her to peel that back and to release that guilt and that shame and realize it wasn't her fault, that she was there trying to serve her country. And if anything, it was her country's fault or some other, bigger issue that placed her there. And that's a really deeply powerful thing, to be able to release that guilt. And another example of that would be that a lot of folks, unfortunately, even the ones that are veterans and fighting in war, most of them have experienced early childhood trauma who develop PTSD later. So another example is of a woman who was processing some of her early sexual trauma as a child, being raped, continuously. And she had a lot of children. Sounds awful and so sad, but a lot of children in those contexts blame themselves. Like, right. I should have said no. I should have done this. I wanted on some level, right. Because sexual trauma can be really complicated. People can be aroused, but still be deeply traumatized. And, so as a child, it's very confusing. So I've seen multiple sessions where people are literally releasing their guilt and forgiving themselves as a child and being like, no, that wasn't your fucking fault. Of course it wasn't your fault. Like, in which you can know in your head. But I think what's so powerful about psychedelics is it allows it to fully be processed. Like, many times we can tell ourselves something in our head, but we don't really feel it in our heart and in our body in the same way. And I believe psychedelic therapy can really make it all come together. So it's not just in your head. And a lot is stored in the body. So even in these sessions, I'll watch people literally moving it out, shaking it, no, it wasn't my fault. You see them pushing it away. So it's super, super powerful. And as you can imagine, that has pretty profound impacts on a person at 60 years old to realize that it wasn't their fault, and how that would impact the rest of their life and the rest of the ways they treat people and all of that. So yeah, I mean, the list goes on. I've worked at MAPS for 6 years, so I can literally infinite stories about how this deeply changes people's lives.
I mean, that's amazing. Just hearing its transformative potential from somebody who's dealt with it firsthand. Is there data that shows the effectiveness of therapy using psychedelics compared to more traditional methods?
That's a great question. And I don't know that we've specifically compared, because it's quite hard to do a controlled comparison between a clinical trial with therapy and then people kind of taking stuff at home. But I would say at MAPS, I'm really grateful to work at MAPS, because unlike other psychedelic organizations, we very much understand and believe that people can have transformative experiences anywhere, including at festivals. So we have something called the Zendo Project for people who are having difficult psychedelic experiences. We're at Burning Man and at a bunch of festivals. And so we're there to support people who are having that kind of experience, but maybe need some more support. And I say support because, though of course it's possible anywhere, in all different contexts, we do find, I guess this is more anecdotal, but I would say strong anecdotal evidence that the people you're with and the place that you are make a huge difference. And you really, if you feel safe, that's one of the best ways to be able to process the experience. So at a festival, for example, if someone's repressed memories from their early childhood trauma are emerging, but they're not in the right place to handle it, it can actually be quite traumatic again. And often when people try to push down scary memories in a psychedelic trip, that's what turns into a bad trip. When we hear people having a bad trip, that's often when they're trying to push something away that's emerging. So for us, it's really essential that you're in a context where whatever comes up, you feel like you're safe enough to let it come up and to process it. Because even if it can be scary at a time, if you're in a place to move through it, by the end of the experience, it often is better than, it kind of helps resolve itself. So, yeah.
Yeah, it seems like there's a level of discomfort and fear that just comes with all psychedelics aside from MDMA in my experience. Would you say from your work in the field, you'd say something similar, that most people, even if you've done it a lot, there's still some battle with your ego, bringing up things from the past, aside from MDMA, which is just this heart explosion, it's just, right? Would you agree?
Definitely. And I'll say for sure MDMA is the kindest of psychedelics, I would say. But even in our sessions, people have quite difficult experiences. It's not some quote I remember was someone saying, "Why do they call this shit ecstasy? This is so difficult."
Wow.
So I think there are, in the moment where you're really facing some of your deepest fears, it can still be difficult, but it's definitely easier to face it with MDMA than without. So I think that's a piece. But yes, when you ask about other psychedelics, they're definitely different than MDMA, like psilocybin, mushrooms, or LSD. Can feel much more detached from this reality sometimes. So that can be quite scary for people. I'll say that in my 6 years at MAPS, the most consistent bad trip stories are from cannabis edibles, actually. So I think that's interesting to just call out that people are most scared of like LSD. But I've heard some like people going to hospitals, cannabis edibles all the time and thinking they're dying. So
if you take
careful of those edibles.
If you take a high dose of edibles, I mean, you could freak the fuck out. Like seriously, I'd say probably like 2-3 times a year. I mean, I guess it depends on the year. I'll take a very high dose of edibles alone and just spend the day with myself. And I go into it knowing that I'm gonna have some level of irrational paranoia. But the amount of insights I get in that, and it could last a full 10 hours. The insights I have in that session, it's insights that I could go the whole year without having. So I see it as tremendously beneficial, but I definitely understand that people could freak out, especially someone unexperienced. There's that famous video where the cop confiscated edibles from somebody, and then you hear him calling the police. I'll play the recording for the people watching now. So recording, there we go.
I love that. Though I have to say something I forgot to mention when you ask about context and how things differ. I mean, with our therapy setting with the 2 therapists and 1 participant, we're really trying to maximize the safety and the outcome. But I really would like to call attention to the fact that our understanding of psychedelics come from indigenous cultures that have been using plant medicines for thousands of years and more even. And the general context that psychedelics are offered in indigenous communities, like ayahuasca, for example, is often served in a circle of people. So there are 1 or 2 facilitators and then a community of people drinking together. And I believe deeply in that as a really helpful context as well for having these experiences. And it's really powerful because often the group's experiences kind of affect each other. You'll be in your experience and you'll hear someone cry out and it will kind of impact yours, but often in a really generative way that feels like it's meant to be and very connected. And especially in places like Israel and Palestine, where so much of the trauma is collective as well. Of course, there's individual trauma, but there's, intergenerational trauma. There's trauma from so many people having to fight in war, and even in this feeling of all of the countries surrounding you are trying to attack you. And like every time I go to the shuk, is there going to be a bombing there? Like that level of trauma that's constant, and to me is a collective trauma. So I suspect that group work would be particularly powerful to deal with that. And it's something I speak about with MAPS a lot because it's quite expensive to have 2 therapists and 1 patient, and much more, I think, forget cost effective, just more effective. It's a very beautiful thing in the first place to have group work, but then again, it is also more cost effective. So I'm very interested in how we can kind of expand that work and make this as accessible to as many people as possible.
Awesome. So you've actually brought us to a crossover of 2 topics I'm very passionate about: psychedelics and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Have you guys done any trials, any group sessions with Israelis and Palestinians?
I don't know. Maybe you don't know about my work, but that's exactly what I'm trying, like a project that I'm working on with Antoine Saka, who is a Palestinian.
So wait, no, I don't mean to cut you off. I know about your work, but the audience doesn't. So I'm.
Got it. Leave it.
Yeah.
So yes, I'm developing a study with Antoine Saka, Palestinian peace activist, and Lior Roseman, who's an Israeli neuroscientist based at Imperial College in London, working with Robin Carhart-Harris. For people familiar, their lab has led a lot of the neuroimaging around psychedelics to understand what's going on in our brain as we trip. And the three of us sought or kind of set out to understand how psychedelics might play a role in facilitating peace. And you know, I even, as I say that, remembering that this is an Israeli audience, I have to say, whenever I use the word peace, my Israeli friends roll their eyes at me. So I think that's pretty telling also. But, you know, I acknowledge I'm a naive American, and I really think we need to talk about the word peace. But so this work is really about community healing and so-called conflict resolution. And we decided before we started setting out on this project that it would be important to interview people who are already having these experiences with one another. And so we started interviewing Israelis and Palestinians who already sit together in ayahuasca ceremony. And we found some really beautiful answers when we kind of were seeking to understand how this experience impacted their personal connection to religion, their personal connection, like their political identity, their religious identity, their social, how they understand each other. And it was quite interesting. Like some people, like even on the religious front, some people got more religious, some people got less religious, but the commonality was that all people got more spiritual and less dogmatic. So even the people who got more religious, they weren't like super into all these strict rules as much as like really connecting to this spiritual side. The people who got less religious were people who were quite dogmatic and strict before and kind of opened up to the spirituality and the flow of religion in a beautiful way. There something that was really powerful, I think you would appreciate, because I know we got to know each other when you were helping create all of these amazing parties for people. But music is something that was one of the most consistently reported things that was like a game changer. There's this quote I remember from an Israeli man who was saying that in the middle of ceremony, someone started singing in Arabic. And he said that it was just completely game-changing for him. He was like, this language that is your most hated language in the world, the only language I've ever hated in the world, all of a sudden I hear it in the middle of a ceremony, and it's sending me love and light. And he was able to really transform his energy and feeling towards the language of Arabic, which of course symbolizes a lot more. And I was really interested by this, and I saw that actually a fucking majority of Israelis, when they hear Arabic in public, they're scared. Like their heart rate goes up, they're terrified. So that's just really striking to me, and kind of an example of what this like ongoing trauma is, you know, that when you're told these are the enemy, these are people trying to kill you, that you're so triggered by every little piece of people's culture, and that makes it nearly impossible to build trust and build love with another community and ultimately build peace. So we're quite excited by the capacity of these medicines to help open people up and reduce their fear. Because that's something I'll say to me is one of the most powerful impacts of psychedelics, is that I find it often can transform fear into love and compassion. And that sounds kind of cheesy, and you know, when you don't see the concrete examples, it's kind of harder to understand, but it's really can be quite literal and have very concrete impacts on people's lives. And another example of that from these interviews is an activist that we interviewed who was a nonviolent activist and was like, I've always been a nonviolent activist, but I realized I was doing it before from a place of kind of like hate and fear. Like there's a Palestinian activist, and like by my nonviolence, I'm showing how violent and horrible Israelis are. You know, that was kind of his drive. But then with the psychedelics, and since he's actually changed to operating from a place of love and compassion, and started working. He's a Palestinian who's been doing work with settlers in the West Bank and people that other Palestinians have said, why the fuck are you working with these people? But he's really found this love instead of this fear and hate to try to build from. And, I also don't want to ignore the fact that fear and hate is very valid in a lot of contexts, so it's not to like dismiss it, but it's more to recognize it and say, oh, I see you, but do I want you to be driving me? Because often when fear drives you, you're very in protective mode. How do I take care of myself and protect myself? And very short-sighted often. Fear makes you just think of how to look right next, and it's quite hard to look at the next 5-10 years and look beyond and look at other people. And I believe that's a really key part of building peace, to be able to look in those greater contexts and not just react out of fear and self-protection.
Do you see any viable path forward to making psychedelics? I guess the goal is for it to be, a mainstream form of medicine all over the world. I'm particularly interested in using it for Israelis and Palestinians because I think this is one of the regions of the world that can most benefit from these medicines. But I also think it's an area of the world that has certain roadblocks that perhaps America doesn't have. One is cultural reasons. And I think, and tell me if you've seen this too, it seems like more so on the Palestinian side, even weed is a big no-no. Cannabis is a big no-no in Palestine. So psychedelics is like a hard drug. Israel has a little bit more of a laid back, and Israel's changed tremendously in the past few decades. Weed used to be like a hardcore drug, a hard drug here too. And now it's become very lax. It's decriminalized. You get weed delivered to your home. And psychedelics is now coming in as more and more popular. Are you guys continuing to work to bring it to the mainstream here? And, what work are you guys doing to achieve that?
Definitely. And I'll say that just anecdotally, and I've been lucky to travel the world with MAPS for the last 6 years. Anecdotally, I think Israelis do more psychedelics per capita than any country I've ever been to. So I suspect there's a lot of trauma playing into that, and the whole practice of traveling the world for the year after the army. But I find that interesting. But you're definitely right about the Palestinian population, that there's a lot more stigma and fear, unfortunately. It's particularly sad to me about cannabis and ganja because there's a long, long history of cannabis use in Muslim and Arab worlds. Lebanon and Egypt are some of the biggest hash, producers, Afghanistan, but, the region has a very rich history of that. So actually, colonialism and imported laws about the war on drugs have kind of intersected with this, have kind of caused this crackdown in Palestine. And often even in Muslim countries where drinking is banned, cannabis is more acceptable, or hash, really, it's hash usually. And we are definitely working, to mainstream these medicines, and it's much more delicate work to do this work in the Palestinian population. We've started by training a few Palestinian therapists to work in our studies. So our approach to mainstreaming is going through the legal system, and we hope by doing that, people will feel safer. If something is legal, something is medicine, it will give them an opportunity to understand this stuff without all of this stigma and dangers attached. But I will also say that there's some basis to the fact that I do think it's less safe for Palestinian folks to be just playing around with psychedelics for many reasons. And first and foremost, they're much more likely to be arrested and tracked by police and followed by police. Also, of course, there's a lot of trauma in Israel, but there's a lot of trauma among Palestinians. So there's more heavy material that could arise if they're not in the right context. And again, this applies to everyone, but I do understand that it's not like I think that the whole Palestinian population should just drop, take a bunch of acid tomorrow. Far from that. It's definitely very serious stuff to be engaged with intention. But yeah, so I would say our mainstreaming approach is using the medical model to teach people in safer ways to get a better sense of what this is. Yeah, and I guess that kind of reminds me of in the US, there's this concept, psychedelics have a very like white face to them, and a lot of researchers are white and like this hippie white thing, even though, indigenous communities of color are where these medicines come from. And there are more and more folks of color in the US who are using these medicines, but they do not have the privilege to speak openly about it. You and I are talking about these experiences we had with things that may or may not be illegal in different places. And a lot of folks don't have that safety. Like in the US, Black mothers are much more likely to lose their children for even smoking cannabis, right? So there's just crazy consequences for people who are marginalized by society to speak openly about this stuff. And then the police thing, again, I mean, I've had many Black friends be like, why would I want to take psychedelics at a festival when I'm one of the only Black people there? The police are already following me around. That sounds like my worst nightmare. Like, that makes perfect sense, So I think that's something important to conceive of. But I want to take the time to also plug a friend, amazing friend, Yahab Erez, who founded Students for Sensible Drug Policy in Israel, conducted a study interviewing Palestinian psychedelic users who have used psychedelics at festivals, at mostly Israeli festivals, trying to better understand their experiences and how to share that with other folks. So I'll send you that info. There's definitely a lot more there that maybe you would want to interview her. She's amazing. But there's a lot more to that for sure.
Yeah, I'd love to speak to her, and I'd love to help in any way I can. If you see any way I could help spread awareness or even help organize groups amongst Israelis and Palestinians, you could always reach out to me. You said something interesting that I never thought about, that marginalized groups are more at risk when it comes to taking psychedelics. So you have a situation that in many ways those who can benefit most from psychedelics are the ones who are less likely to use them. Right. Yeah, I'm thinking out loud right now. That's interesting. So what is the approach to just continue to study it, continue to raise awareness, and try to hit the tipping point like we did with marijuana, where it's now legal in most of the states, or decriminalized in most of the states in the America? Is it?
Say even with that, which is so fucked up, even the states that legalized cannabis still arrest more Black people for cannabis. Like, racism doesn't really go away, and there's still a lot of. So I think that's part of the answer, but not the full answer, unfortunately. And yeah, to reiterate what you're asking, marginalized groups experience the highest amount of trauma. So, and if you're a highly traumatized person, that does make your psychedelic experience prone to, you're processing stuff. So it's really important that you're in the right space for that. And similar to what I was saying about training Palestinian therapists, we actually made a big effort to make sure we're training therapists of color in the US. And we believe that's really the best way forward, that these therapists not only can work in these medical contexts, but also as more trauma experts of color understand psychedelics, they are best suited, I believe, to be figuring out how to integrate and introduce these medicines and create safer contexts for people to try psychedelics. And it's really changing and growing. And, I have to name things like there's a festival like Afropunk, which is a very psychedelic festival, like focused, like it's called Afropunk. And it's a context that a lot of people are maybe experimenting in. And this is, so many rappers from A$AP Rocky had an album, called LSD. And there's a lot of more mainstream recognition right now of these medicines. So I do think that's changing. And that also changes our cultural setting when there's more acceptance around these medicines. So you're not like, oh my God, I took this horrible thing that's so bad. It's like, oh, I'm taking this medicine, like having a difficult experience, but it'll be okay. Even knowing that in your head is quite helpful. Like we've had so many people say that knowing that the Zendo project was at Burning Man helped their trip. They didn't even go there, but they were like having a bit of a difficult time, and they were like, okay, I know I can go there, and that's part of the experience, and then it kind of resolved. So I think it's really important, that mental space of understanding of what's happening to you and what your options are if you need support. But it's something I really care deeply about, how we can best leverage these powerful medicines to help people, not help, but give access to people who are most in need of this stuff. And I'll kind of end this rant around with focusing back on Israel, and thinking about, like, of course, the Palestinian population, which we've spoken about, but I would love to draw attention to the Ethiopian Israeli population and the many Israelis of color that suffer so much discrimination, and the same shit that, you know, people experience in the US, but it feels like it's not talked about as much in Israel, which is even more traumatizing on that front. So I would really love to see and be interested to see how these medicines can help provide some new contexts for people to have healing experiences in Israeli society.
So it's interesting you bring that up, because the last guest I interviewed, which I mentioned him at the very beginning of this episode, a friend of mine named Ashriel, he's a black rights activist here in Israel. So he's working in those communities to raise awareness. And it's true there's less awareness, because it's like we all, white Israelis, black Israelis, we have a common enemy, which is the Palestinians. Like, I think that kind of is like what takes up our narrative of, like, you know, who our enemy is. So it's almost like whenever people want to speak of an issue, it's just so easy to deflect, but we have a more important issue to deal with. But we face existential threat from our Palestinian neighbors and our Arab neighbors. So I feel like it's the Israelis' own trauma and own fear which makes it harder for us to confront our own internal issues. Bidjuk, yeah, which means exactly for those who don't speak Hebrew.
You really hit the nail on the head for me, which is why it's so sad. Like in the US, you know, some of the most racist folks are poor white people that, you know, that's all that, it's like they got to, all the shit that comes their way, it feels better to like push towards someone else. And I know in Israel, that's also often the case, that like Mizrahi and Jews of color can be, you know, that particularly racist against Palestinians. And I do feel like it's often internalizing a lot of the shit that they're receiving. And also something that's been really interesting, actually, back to our, like, the conflict resolution research, is that a lot of Jewish Israelis who actually have Arab heritage are reclaiming that and realizing, wait, I'm a Jewish Arab. Like, my grandparents spoke Arabic. Arabic music is what connects with me. Arabic food is my culture. I am Jewish and I'm Arab. And so much of how Israeli society, they don't even use the word Palestinian. They say Jews and Arabs, which is bullshit, because they're Jewish Arabs, right? So there's creating this separation and also this self-hatred. Like, a lot of, you know, Israeli Arabs don't like that part of themselves and are embarrassed and don't want to speak Arabic. Like, all of my friends said their parents didn't speak to them in Arabic because they were too embarrassed. Like, they're really cutting that off. So I feel like that self-hatred is really projected often on others, and that's a really dangerous part of the cycle for me.
Very interesting. And we actually see something I don't know if it's so similar. There's not Palestinians that are coming to terms with Jewish identity, but they've discovered that a fair amount of Palestinians have Jewish DNA.
That's crazy?
Yeah.
I mean, not so crazy, actually. But
right.
Yeah,
and
so striking.
And I think what the story is, Jews have had a presence here. Not Jews have not controlled this land for thousands of years, but Jews have had a presence here for thousands of years. So whenever the Arab, I don't I don't want to mess up the history, but I think it was like the Arab imperialism. Is that what it's called, or Arab something? When there was a time where Arabs first came from Saudi Arabia to Israel. They think that a lot of the Jews that were living there just intermixed with Arabs, and a lot of those are the modern day Palestinians. So it's interesting. Palestinians are not just Arabs; they're Arab part Jew, and then the Jews that now live in Israel and identify as Jewish. They're part Jewish, but also part mixed with Europe and the Arabic countries they came. So we have a lot we have a lot more in common than we than we think.
Add to your story, a Palestinian activist I know is 80% Jewish from his 23andMe. So I don't think it was as far back as what you're saying only. Like for sure, also that, but I think it's even been more recent than people like to remember and acknowledge. He was totally shocked to find that, as you can imagine. But I mean, I think it's super interesting. And I've also heard, I wonder if you know the answer to this, that the Israeli government has made these tests illegal because they don't want people to know that we're all the same, basically.
Okay. Because I was just going to say that I think the two most important tools to help bring peace on this land is psychedelics and DNA tests.
I totally agree.
So
and the combo, can you imagine? I mean, people having that knowledge, and then, something I didn't talk about actually, and when I was talking about the interviews, it's one of the most powerful things is people have these memory, collective trauma memories of they're in a house. One person was doing a ceremony in a house and they saw the Palestinian family being evicted from the house, carrying all of their shit, Israeli soldiers forcing them out. They had that whole process of a scene in their mind in that ayahuasca ceremony, and often the scenes kind of bleed together, so it's so powerful. A Palestinian person recounted being behind the eyes of a gun of an IDF soldier and looking at a Palestinian person and pulling the trigger, and he felt deep compassion. Imagine this, deep compassion. Sorry, my boss is calling. Deep compassion for the Israeli soldier. This Palestinian came out of this wow, that is so awful. I can't imagine how much that would change you to have to shoot someone. And that was just so powerful to me. But I think there is a lot of
that's beautiful
room for stuff there. Yeah, sorry about that call.
No, all good. I like the fact that these episodes are natural. So I want people to know sometimes we get a call. It's all good. We're just two human beings who happen to be friends, who happen to be activists, who are just having a good conversation. That's all it is. So before we wrap up, is there something that people can do to help? How can I help? How can we help?
Few ways. I mean, the first thing I have to say, we work at a nonprofit, so donating is hugely helpful, truly.
I'll put the link in the description.
Thank you. But more than that, actually, I would say feeling when you feel safe to speak about this work, that's what best mainstreams it, right? People learn about this from people they trust, from their friends, from their family. If you're able to speak about your experiences or about the research to people who maybe you're unsure, and just kind of, not force anything, but just share your experiences, that's really how this tidal change is going to happen. So every single person really can make a difference that way. And you never know who the one person you talk to might talk to that one other person who is a game changer. And I'll even say, actually, speaking of that, at Midburn, where I saw you a few years ago, I met someone who I was talking to about this work, and a really sweet guy, just didn't think much of it. Turns out he brought me to meet with the head of mental health at the Israeli Ministry of Health. They ended up supporting our work, and the rest is history. The Israeli Ministry of Health is working better with us than any other government. And that, comes down to a conversation I had at Midburn. So really don't be shy about that. I understand not everyone can feel safe to talk about it, and that's another difficult part of it, but speak your mind. And we have map stickers, like put a sticker on your phone, on your computer, see how people talk to you, how they respond. That's what I ask of everyone.
Amen, sister. I'm a full supporter. Natalie, it was a true pleasure having you on. If there's any, I think you summed it up perfectly, but if there are any final thoughts, final words, you're more than welcome to share them.
I guess I'll take this time to plug a bit around safe use. I know a lot of these listeners are not doing it in therapy settings and are taking it at festivals or with friends. And I would just really encourage, again, being careful of who you're with and where you're with, and also test your drugs. This is my big ending plug. Especially MDMA is almost always cut with other shit that's much more dangerous than the MDMA. So you can order drug tests online that can tell you what you're taking, and make sure that you're taking what you think you're taking. Even LSD can be contaminated with shit. Like, it's really important. The biggest danger of these drugs is what they're mixed with. So that's what I'll end on. Test your MDMA.
Amazing. I'm happy you ended on that, because that is super important, something people forget. So again, Natalie, thank you so much. Thank you for the awesome work you do and for standing up for a cause you believe in, a super important cause. And yeah, I'd love to have you on again in the near future. I had a great time.
Yeah, this was so nice. Thank you for all of your amazing work too. And I hope we can work together in the future on I know a lot of our work intersects a lot. So I look forward to that.
I'm positive we will.